Okay, so today I'm going to talk about Chapter 9, which is centered on counseling, psychosocial support, and assertiveness training. So here's a little overview of the different types of interventions. Counseling, we talked about a little bit in Chapter 8. One of the primary goals is to understand their hearing loss and various components of that. Counseling is usually broken down into a few categories: informational counseling, personal adjustment counseling, and then affective counseling, and we'll talk a little bit about each. Psychosocial support is basically learn about their psychological social difficulties that result from the hearing loss and how to effectively deal with them. And then assertiveness training, which is learn how to state negative, positive feelings and kind of act as an advocate for themselves. So here are some of the goals of counseling. On the left, you can take a look and read them. The first couple are usually done after the hearing test. Excuse me. And then the management of the difficulties. A lot of the bullet points below the top two are done through the hearing aid fitting process. And then on the right, you have the type of counseling. So you have informational and personal adjustment counseling, and it gives you some information about each one. So as we talked about, informational counseling is where you're giving a lot of information about the hearing loss, hearing aids, and so forth. It's usually an informal dialogue. You present it in layman's kind of easy to understand language, and you use explicit categorization. So, when you're talking about hearing loss, you're talking about types, degrees, impacts, and then moving on to other topics like hearing aids. That's a very specific topic, and so forth. Personal adjustment counseling focuses on the adjustment and acceptance, and there's a few different approaches. The cognitive approach, which is essentially trying to help them modify their thought process. The behavioral approach, which is modifying their behavior, and then the affective approach, which is trying to modify their emotions, and we'll talk about each one. So the cognitive approach is essentially founded in cognitive therapy. When you think of a cognitive disorder, it's basically a disorder of thinking. So they have thoughts that are often irrational. They're just not accurate. And so that's what you're trying to do here. One way is the rational emotive behavior therapy. And essentially you identify through this therapy, you identify activating events or adversity, you evaluate them, you identify the consequences, and then you have to dispute the negative feelings, help them dispute the negative feelings and create a positive effective action. So one of the things that we encounter all the time in audiology is people come in and they'll say, "Oh, I've heard hearing aids they don't help." Right? That's just kind of an incorrect statement. So we try to help get them through that initial, if you will, disorder of thought. So here's some cost-benefit considerations, right? And you can take a look at these. I'm not going to go over it, but this is often the cost-benefit kind of analysis, if you will, is often used in cognitive approaches. Now, the behavioral approach, if you think back to your introductory psychology course, I'm sure you talked about B.F. Skinner in the let's say late 30s or so, 40s, and the concept of operant conditioning. And essentially a behavioral approach is designed to change behaviors. And if you think of operant conditioning, right, you're using some kind of reward to increase the response. So There's also a concept of desensitization that's designed to reduce the negative reaction through, repeated exposures, through consistent experiences. And again, another aspect of this is to improve the behavior, improve the desired behavior through positive experiences. That's more of the operant conditioning. And of course, the affective approach is a approach that really focuses on individuals' feelings and finding this congruence with self. So if you think back to your intro psych course, you probably talked about Carl Rogers. I think I spelled that right. I don't think it's a K. I think it's a C. If not, forgive me. But Carl Rogers used this person-centered approach, and it's all about finding congruence or being accepting of ourselves. And it uses unconditional positive regard, and it employs empathetic understanding. Okay. And so you can see on the right, you have a Likert type scale that asks questions that are dealing with personal feelings. So that's the affective approach. Psychosocial support is designed to do all of the following: alleviate hearing-related stress, including all of those. Patients will often feel inadequate, isolated, have negative self-image issues, and so the psychosocial support is designed to help with all of those things. So oftentimes, the person with the hearing loss is not always the person, is not the sole person that is feeling the negative ramifications or effects of the hearing loss and all of the things that we've talked about. Oftentimes, the communication partner, which is a spouse or the adult children of the person with hearing loss. And there you can see some of the consequences associated with communication partners. They may have feelings of frustration, reduced talking and joking. It basically affects their entire all their interactions with the individual. So when we talk about support paradigms, you need to learn, the patient needs to learn initially how the hearing loss impacts their life, and then recognize any negative perceptions or changes in behaviors, isolation and so forth. And then they work to change the self-perceptions to gain more confidence. And then oftentimes during group AR therapy, they will break out into groups if it's a large group. And talk through a lot of this stuff. So here's a model where you have a problem, you identify the problem, you set some kind of objective, you explore the problem, and then you work to resolve the problem. So here's an example where you identify the problem, okay? You develop objectives, you work in groups to explore that problem and how others have dealt with it. And then you explore scenarios to help solve that problem. Okay. And so here's an example you can read. You can hit pause and take a read. So resolving the problems, you first need to define some outcome and identify solutions. Then select a solution, try it, evaluate it, and then modify it. And here's an example. Excuse me. So here's that written out. So number 1, you list your problems. 2, you write your goal. So again, we talked about goals. We tell them to have some kind of measurable, use some kind of percentage correct or percentage of the time that they're able to do a particular task. Then they put all the ideas that they can think about to meet that goal in number 3. Number 4, they judge each idea. Number 5, they choose one, they try it. And then number 6, After they try it, then they determine if it met their goal. So here's an example. So in this example, the problem is they can't hear the announcements at church. Their goal is to understand at least 80% of them. They brainstormed some of the possible solutions. Then they kind of judged each one, and kind of thought about how that option might translate into success. Then they picked one. So in this case, they ask about an assistive listening device, and then they assess the efficacy, or was it successful. And the last thing that I want to talk about is assertiveness training. Assertiveness training, again, is important, but it's often difficult to have patients move on this or use this because many of them don't like to self-identify that they have hearing loss and so forth. So, but it's designed to enhance the communication between the person and whatever the communication, or whomever the communication partner is at the time. It does require they identify that they have hearing loss. Again, people don't often like to do that, but it often results in some kind of request to modify the environment in some way, sitting in a different area, using assistive listening device, and so forth. The communication partner then facilitates the understanding of the message through this, and there is an important aspect of this, which is the reinforcement for the communication partner to kind of demonstrate the reduction in communication issues. And so I see it a lot in when I was in practice. Assistive listening, mini mics. Remember, we talked about the microphones that patients can buy. It's not an FM system, but it's a microphone that a patient can buy for usually $200 to $350, $200 to $350, and they provide that microphone to, let's say, a pastor, priest, or what have you, and then the microphone transmits the sermon, the homily, whatever, directly to the individual. And so that is one way that a patient can take control and be assertive about their hearing loss. Now, again, some patients don't like to self-identify that they have hearing loss, and our goal is to try to get them to understand, yes, you have to self-identify, but in the end, you will reap a lot of benefits from using this particular device. So once they get over that hurdle, typically they're willing to do it, and it's amazing how much more they hear and report back to us. So that's it for Chapter 9.